My name is Norbert Marta. I am a teacher in a secondary school with Agrar profile. Previously, we have talked about the operation of the sun and how the sunlight gets to the earth. Now, the third part of this course, I will speak about the importance of the sunlight in the life of earth. I hope you will enjoy it. In this chapter, we will learn about photosynthesis and also find out what chlorophyll, chloroplast, light reaction, light-independent reaction mean. And we will get to know the importance of the sunlight on different life forms, meaning plants, animals, and humans. Sun, the main source of life. At first, let's have a look on the earliest life forms on Earth. The age of the Earth is about 4.54 billion years. The earliest undisputed evidence of the life on Earth dates from at least 3.5 billion years ago. There is evidence that suggests life began as early as 4.5 billion years ago. The proof for the earliest life form was found in Australia in 2017. It is 3.5 billion years old and it's called stromatolite. Stromatolites are layered biochemical excretionary structures formed in shallow water by trapping, binding, and cementation of sedimentary grains by biofilms of microorganisms, especially cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are aquatic and photosynthetic. That is, they live in the water and can manufacture their own food. Because they are bacteria, they are quite small, usually unicellular, so they often grow in colonies large enough to see. They have the distinction of being the oldest known fossils, more than 3.5 billion years old. In fact, it may surprise you then to know that the cyanobacteria are still around. They are one of the largest and most important groups of bacteria on Earth. They were the first photosynthetic organism, which means that they produce oxygen and use carbon dioxide to build glucose. It is quite obvious that most living organisms need oxygen to the life. Now you see the body of cyanobacteria. It is the cell. There are chloroplasts. Primary chloroplasts are cell organelles found in some eukaryotic lineage, and they are specialized in performing the photosynthesis. They are considered to have evolved from endosymbiotic cyanobacteria. Sun and plants. Let's talk about the importance of sunlight in the life of plants. At first, we should clarify what photosynthesis means. Photosynthesis is a process used by plants and other organisms to convert light energy into chemical energy that can later be released to fuel the organism's activities. This chemical energy is stored in carbohydrate molecules, such as sugar, which are synthesized from carbon dioxide and water. The name photosynthesis comes from Greek words phos, it means light, and synthesis. Most cases, oxygen is also released as a waste product. Most plants, most algae, and cyanobacteria perform photosynthesis. Such organisms are called photoautotrophs. Photosynthesis is largely responsible for producing and maintaining the oxygen content of the Earth's atmosphere and supplies most of the most of the energy necessary for the life on Earth. Now you see how carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, the energy from the sun, react to each other and create oxygen, water, and carbohydrate. Then carbohydrates will transform into glucose. Some interesting things. 1 hectare, 40 years old forest uses 900 tons of carbon dioxide from the air during its lifetime. One old tree produces 200 kilograms of oxygen in a year. One non-electric car uses 5,000 kilograms of oxygen in a year. It's time to get to know the method of photosynthesis. Almost all plants are autotrophs. Autotroph means the organs make organic matters from non-organic matters. Some plants are not able to do this. These are heterotrophs. For example, the dudder on the right side of picture. The dudder doesn't contain chlorophyll. After a dudder attached itself to a plant, it wraps itself around it. If the host contains food beneficial to the dudder, this parasitic plant will produce haustoria that will get into the vascular system of the host and uses its nutrients. The original root of the dudder in the soil then dies. The dudder can grow and attach itself to multiple plants. On the left side, you see another heterotroph organ. Fungi are not plants. They do not have chlorophyll. Now you can see the short method of photosynthesis. The energy comes from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil. After the photosynthesis, the results are glucose and oxygen. Without sunlight, the energy coming from the sun, it would not work. Let's move on and talk about the division of light. Sunlight is a portion of the electromagnetic radiation given off by the sun, in particular infrared, visible, and ultraviolet light. On Earth, sunlight is scattered and filtered through the Earth's atmosphere, and it's obvious it's daylight when the sun is above the horizon. Sunshine is a combination of bright light and radiant heat. Ordinarily, sunlight is broken down into three major components: visible light with wavelengths between 0.4 and 0.8 micrometers, ultraviolet light with wavelengths shorter than 0.4 micrometers, and infrared radiation with wavelengths longer than 0.8 micrometers. The visible portion constitutes nearly half of the total radiation received at the surface of Earth. Although ultraviolet light constitutes only a very small proportion of the total radiation, this component is extremely important. It produces vitamin D through the activation of ergosterol. Infrared radiation has its chief merit in its heat-producing quality. Close to the half of total solar radiation received at the surface of Earth is infrared. Let me ask you a question. Do you know why leaves are green for most of the year? The color of most is in green from spring to autumn. Why? The short answer is because the most useful wavelengths are red and blue for the plants, and they use these wavelengths. Let me explain in some more details. Plants are green because they have green chloroplasts, organelles that carry out photosynthesis. Why are chloroplasts green? Chloroplasts are green because they contain the green pigment chlorophyll in their thylakoid membranes. Chlorophyll is a pigment that absorbs red and blue light. Then why is chlorophyll green? To understand why chlorophyll is green, we must learn about pigments. A pigment is something that absorbs light. We say that chlorophyll is a pigment that absorbs blue and red light. So, why it is green. That's because pigments absorb some wavelengths of light and reflect others. A yellow pigment is one that absorbs all of wavelengths of light except yellow. The yellow color is reflected into your eyes, and that is why it looks yellow. The reason a red shirt is red is because the red pigment's shirt absorbs all the light except red. That reflected light is the color that the shirt appears. If it is reflected all light, then it would be white. So plants are green because the chlorophyll reflects green light. And chlorophyll is found in all plants because it is the molecule that absorbs the light that is used to make sugar. Take a look at the cells of a plant's leaf. As you know, every living organism is made of cells. The cells of plants contain chloroplasts. You can see these cells formed through the microscope. The chloroplast number per cells represent a frequently examined quantitative anatomical parameter reflecting various leaf internal and external conditions. It can be influenced by internal factors such as fluidity and environmental factors, for example, carbon dioxide. As you see, the average number of chloroplasts in a plant cell are from 10 to 100. Now, I will talk about the method of photosynthesis, but at first, we should learn some facts about the history of the discovery of photosynthesis. The history of the studies done in photosynthesis dates back in the 17th century with Jean Baptiste van Helmont. He rejected the ancient idea that plants take most of their biomass from the soil. For the proof, he performed willow tree experiment. He started with a willow tree of 2.27 kg. Over 5 years, it grew to 67.7 kilograms. However, the weight of the soil only decreased by 57 grams. Van Helmont came to the conclusion that plants must take most of their weight from water. He didn't know about gases. Joseph Priestley was another scientist who contributed to the discovery of photosynthesis. He was born in 1733 and later became a chemist, minister, natural philosopher, educator, and political theorist. His experiments included placing a lit candle inside a closed jar. The flame quickly went out, and Priestley concluded that the air inside the jar had been injured. He concluded similar experiments with the mice and concluded the mice had also injured the air. Priestley later discovered that plants could be used to restore air what was injured by the candle and the mice. In 1774, the results of Priestley's experiment were published in Experiments and Observations of Different Kinds of Air, Volume 1. Although Priestley didn't know it at the time, his experiments proved that air contains oxygen. Jan Ingelhaus also contributed to the discovery of photosynthesis. He was a Dutch chemist, biologist, and physiologist who performed important experiments in the late 18th that proved that plants produce oxygen. Ingelhaus placed submerged plants in sunlight and then in shade. He noticed that small bubbles were produced by plants when they were in the sunlight. When they were transferred to the shade, bubbles were no longer produced by these plants. Ingelhaus later concluded that plants use light to produce oxygen. In 1796, Jean Senevier, a Swiss botanist, pastor, and naturalists demonstrated that plants absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen with the help of sunlight. In the early 19th century, Nicholas Theodore de Source demonstrated that while plants need carbon dioxide, the increased mass of growing plants is not the result of carbon dioxide alone, but also the uptake of water. In the 1840s, Julius Robert Mayer, a German physician and physicist, stated that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. This is known as the first law of thermodynamics. He proposed that plants convert light energy into chemical energy. Cornelis van Neer made key discoveries explaining the chemistry of photosynthesis. By studying purple sulfur bacteria and green bacteria, he was the first to demonstrate the photosynthesis is a light-dependent redox reaction in which hydrogen reduces carbon dioxide. Samuel Rubin and Martin Kalman used radioactive isotopes to determine that oxygen liberated in photosynthesis came from the water. Melvin Calvin and Andrew Benson, along with James Basham, estimated the path of carbon assimilation in plants. The carbon reduction cycle is known as the Calvin cycle, which ignores the contribution of Basham and Benson. This is a short history of the discovery of photosynthesis. Now, you see the parts of a plant. From the left to the right, at first the leaves of a tree, then the structure of a leaf. The cells which contain chloroplasts are in the mesophyll part. Photosynthesis takes place here. You can see the stomata on the leaves. Stomata are tiny opening or pores in plant tissue that allow for gas exchange. They typically found in plant leaves, but can also be found in some stems. Specialized cells known as guard cells surround stomata and function to open and close stomata pores. Stomata allow a plant to take in carbon dioxide, which is needed for photosynthesis. They also help to reduce water loss by closing when conditions are hot or dry. They look like tiny mouths which open and close as they assist in transpiration. Plants that reside on land typically have thousands of stomata on the surface of their leaves. The majority of stomata are located on the underside of plant leaves, reducing their exposure to heat and air current. These tiny mouths are open during the day because this is when photosynthesis typically occurs. Now I will introduce the exact course of photosynthesis. At first, we will learn what ATP and NADPH are. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is an organic compound and hydrotope that provides energy to drive many processes in living cells. NADPH is a typical coenzyme used in adduction reaction, seen in the anabolic pathway of organisms. For example, when sugars are created during photosynthesis, carbon molecules are chained together using the energy from sunlight. NADPH function is transferring electrons and hydrogen displaced by energy of sunlight. The NADPH first accepts the electrons and hydrogen when special enzymes transfer these particles to the molecule NADP positive. In this reaction, the NADP positive becomes reduced when it accepts the electrons and hydrogen, going from a positive electrical state to a more negative neutral state as an NADPH molecule. Then the NADPH molecule is oxidized by another enzyme. NADPH works with a wide variety of enzymes, and is considered one of the universal electron carriers. Photosynthesis has two stages. The first is a light-dependent stage, where the light energy is converted into ATP and NADPH. The second stage is named light-independent reaction, or Calvin cycle. During this stage, glucose is synthesized from carbon dioxide and water using ATP and NADPH, which are outcome of the light-dependent reaction. In the light-dependent reactions, one molecule of the pigment chlorophyll absorbs one photon and loses one electron. This electron is passed to the modified form of chlorophyll called phytophytin, which passes the electron to quinone molecule, starting the flow of electrons down the electron transport chain that leads to ultimate reduction of NADP to NADPH. In addition, this creates a proton gradient across the chloroplast membrane, which is used by ATP synthesized in the synthesis of ATP. The chlorophyll molecule ultimately regains the electron it lost when a water molecule is split in a process called photolysis, which releases a dioxygen molecule as a base product. Not all wavelengths of light can support photosynthesis. The photosynthetic action spectrum depends on the type of accessory pigments present. For example, in green plants, the action spectrum resembles the absorption spectrum for chlorophyll and carotenoids, with absorption peaks in violet, blue, and red light. In red algae, the action spectrum is blue-green light, which allows this algae to use the blue end of spectrum to grow in the deeper waters that filtered out the longer wavelengths used by above-ground green plants. The non-absorbed part of the light spectrum is what gives photosynthetic organisms their color, and is the least effective for photosynthesis in the representative organisms. Summary, you see how light-dependent reaction works. You, like all organisms on Earth, are carbon-based life form. In other words, the complex molecules of your body are built on carbon backbones. You might already know that you are carbon-based, but have you ever wondered where all of the carbon comes from? As it turns out, the atoms of carbon in your body were once part of carbon molecules in the air. Carbon atoms end up in you and in other life forms, thanks to the second stage of photosynthesis, known as Calvin cycle. In plants, carbon dioxide enters the interior of leaf via stomata and diffuses into the stroma of chloroplast, the site of the Calvin cycle reaction, where sugar is synthesized. These reactions are also called the light-independent reaction because they are not directly driven by light. In the Calvin cycle, carbon atoms on carbon dioxide are fixed and used to build free carbon sugars. This process is fueled by and dependent on ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. Unlike the light reactions which take place in the thylakoid membrane, the reaction of Calvin cycle takes place in stroma. This is the inner space of chloroplast. The Calvin cycle reaction can be divided three main stages: carbon fixation, reduction, and regeneration of the starting molecule. First one, carbon fixation. A carbon dioxide molecule combines with a 5-carbon acceptor molecule, ribulose biophosphate. This step makes a 6-carbon compound that splits into 2 molecules of a 3-carbon compound. This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme Rubisco. Reduction. The second part, reduction. In the second stage, ATP and NADPH are used to convert the free PGA molecules into molecules of a 3-carbon sugar, glycerinaldehyde 3-phosphate. This stage gets its name because NADPH donates electrons to or reduces a 3-carbon intermediate to make G3P. Third part, regeneration. Some G3P molecules go to make glucose, while others must be recycled to renegade to RUBP acceptor. Regeneration requires ATP and involves a complex network of reactions, which might Let's see how glucose is built up. Glucose is a monosaccharide whose 5 hydroxyl groups are arranged in a specific way along its 6 carbon. Glucose is produced by plants through the photosynthesis using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, and can be used by all living organisms as an energy and carbon source. However, most glucose doesn't occur in its free form, but in the form of its polymers. Lactose, starch, and other which are energy reserve substances are cellulose and chitin, which are components of all cell walls in plants or fungi. Now you have learned almost everything about photosynthesis and can check the acquired knowledge. The first question is related to the history of photosynthesis. If you take a plant under a jar where there is no oxygen, only sunlight comes from outside and the plant is watered regularly, what do you think will happen? The plant will die, the plant won't grow, the plant will grow and die and live. Yes, the plant will grow, as Joseph Priestley, the English scientist, has discovered in the 18th century. He has taken a big step to understand the mechanism plant life. Quiz number 2. Creatures are diverse. What do you think? Are all living organs able to make photosynthesis? The fungi and viruses too? No, the fungi and viruses can't make photosynthesis because they do not have chloroplast, so they can't make organic material from inorganic material. The animals cannot either. Sunlight and the animals. Now we will look at the role of the sunlight in the animal life. As we know, animals are not able to make photosynthesis. So, from where they get energy for living? Of course, from the food. The energy of food comes from the sun. And now we learn a new concept, the food chain. That does that mean? Plants can make photosynthesis, make organic material from inorganic material with help of the sunlight. So they produce glucose, which is the most important material of life. Lots of animals eat plants, so they use energy from the plants to build up their own bodies. They use energy from the sunlight. Other animals eat plants, so the energy of the sun goes onto the other animals. This is a food chain. You see a food chain on the land. Like every food chain, it also starts with plants. The plants use inorganic materials and sunlight to build their own bodies. The organic material produced by plants is eaten by grasshopper. Then the grasshopper is eaten by the frog by snake, then the snake by the hawk, and finally, when the hawk dies, the bacteria and fungi decompose the dead body, so they produce inorganic materials. Let's see the aquatic food chain. One-celled life organisms use sunlight and inorganic materials to build their own bodies. These organisms are eaten by shrimp-like creatures, the shrimp-like creatures by the small fish by mackerel, then the mackerel by the tuna fish, and in the end, the tuna fish by the shark. Dead bodies are decomposed by one-celled organisms. This is how it has been since beginning of time. Let us take a look on the effect of the sun on the life of the fishes, amphibians, and reptiles. Temperature plays a key role defining special distributions, temporal activity patterns, and bodily function of species, populations, and individuals. As we know, fishes, amphibians, and reptiles are ectothermic animals. That means their body temperature are mostly determined by the temperature of their environment. These animals bask in the sun to warm up their bodies. They collect energy from the sun. Reptile reproduction also depends on temperature. Only boas and pythons give birth to live descendants. Other species may lay their eggs in simple nests and live. The young hatch from the eggs only later. The soil temperature is critical during this time. It determines the gender of the youngs. Of course, sunlight affects the human bodies too. First, let's see the positive effects. It enhances your mood. Being in the sun can make people feel better and have more energy. Sunlight increases the levels of serotonin in the brain, which is associated with improved mood. Not surprisingly, serotonin levels are highest in summer. 3. Seasonal depression. In certain people, the lack of sunlight in the winter seems to trigger depression. Symptoms include bad moods, difficulty making and keeping friends, overeating, tiredness, sleeping too much. Seasonal depression, formerly known as seasonal affective disorder, is rare in the warmer months. Sunlight relieves stress and also improves sleep. Sunlight exposure impacts how much melatonin your brain produces, which is what tells your brain when it is time to sleep. When it gets dark, you start producing melatonin, so you are ready to sleep in about 2 hours. With the more sunlight in summer, you are likely to feel more awake. There is also vitamin D. This is the vitamin involved in maintaining healthy bone strength. One way you can get this sun vitamin is exposure to ultraviolet light from the sun. However, you don't need much time in the sun to reap the benefits. Doctors recommend only 15 minutes of sun exposure to provide all the vitamin D you need. It has a cardiovascular benefit. The study showed that exposure to ultraviolet rays present in sunlight reduced blood pressure by increasing the level of nitric oxide in blood. As you know, the high blood pressure is the main risk factor of the heart disease. It treats your skin. Lot of skin ailments have been treated with sunlight, for example, eczema, scleroma. However, there are negative effects as well. Long-term unprotected exposure to ultraviolet light from the sun can damage the retina. The retina is the back of the eye, where the rods and cones make visual images, which are then sent to the visual centers in the brain. Damage from exposure to sunlight can also cause the development of cloudy bumps along the edge of the cornea, which can then grow over the cornea and prevent clear vision. Heat exhaustion is the body's response to extensive loss of water and salt, usually through extensive sweating. People working in a hot environment are at risk of heat exhaustion. If heat exhaustion is left untreated, it can lead to heat stroke. Heat stroke is the most serious heat-related illness and can be life-threatening. Sunburn is widely recognized as one of the most common negative effects of too much sun exposure. Research says the maximum symptoms of sunburn do not usually appear until about 4 or 5 hours after the sun exposure occurs. Ultraviolet light is the cause of sunburn, which comes from the sun. A heat rash is a skin rash that occurs when sweat ducts trap perspiration under the skin. Heat rash often take place during hot, humid weather and often looks like red clusters of pimples or small blisters. Research says the worst consequence of the long-term exposure to the sun is the development of skin cancer, because the sun damage to the skin develops over years. The older you are, the greater the risk of developing skin cancer. And the effects, which is more of interesting to the female gender, wrinkles. We associate wrinkles with aging, but sun exposure is a significant factor in their development and how early they appear. UV light damages collagen and elastic tissues in the skin, so it becomes fragile and does not spring back into shape, causing sagging. And I have one more quiz for you in the end. Choose the right answers from the 5 statements. There are more of them. Sunlight heats the body of amphibians and reptiles. This is right. We have learned that amphibians and reptiles are ectothermic animals, so they need have sunlight to warm up their bodies. Sunlight helps the synthesis of vitamin A. This is not correct. As sunlight helps the synthesis of vitamin D. Sunlight is necessary for the photosynthesis in the Calvin cycle. This answer is wrong as well, because the Calvin cycle is the second part of photosynthesis where no sunlight is needed. Sunlight is necessary for the photosynthesis and the electron transport. Yes, this is right, because the electron transport takes place in the first part of the photosynthesis, where sunlight energy is transformed chemical energy. The sunlight relieves stress. Yes, this is correct as well. Fresh air and little sunlight relieves stress. Now, we come to the end of this topic. So thank you for your attention. Next time, we will take a closer look at the history of solar energy. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed it.